All right, let's set the scene. It's the early 2000s. The internet is still loading on dial-up. You're burning mixed CDs because streaming isn't a thing yet. Flip phones are peak technology. MTV still plays music. Life is good. But then, out of nowhere, the car industry collectively decides to rewind time like someone sat on the remote. It starts slowly. A few cars show up looking suspiciously familiar. You see a Volkswagen Beetle on the road and think, wait, didn't those stop making those, like, decades ago? Then you notice a brand new Ford Thunderbird, but it looks like something out of a black and white movie. And before you can process what's happening, boom, the entire industry is flooded with cars that look like they were ripped straight from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. This wasn't just a trend, this was an epidemic. And here's the thing, car companies didn't just casually dip their toes into nostalgia. They dove in headfirst, full speed, no seatbelts. It was like a midlife crisis on a corporate scale. The Mustang went full 60s. The Challenger came back from the dead looking like it never left the disco era. Chrysler, Volkswagen, Chevy, Jaguar, every major automaker was reaching deep into their archives, dusting off old designs and saying, let's do that again. At first, it felt kind of cool. A fresh take on classic designs? Hell yeah. But then, it spiraled out of control. By the mid-2000s, if you were a car brand and you weren't reviving a decades-old model, you were basically slacking. Ford had the retro Mustang. Dodge had the Challenger. Chevy brought back the Camaro. And then there were the weird ones. Cars like the PT Cruiser, the Chevy SSR, and the Plymouth Prowler, which made you wonder if designers were just playing a prank on us. And let's be honest, some of these cars were straight-up imposters. They looked the part, but under the hood, disappointment. The Plymouth Prowler looked like a hot rod but had the engine of a minivan. The VW New Beetle brought back the old-school vibes but drove like a bland, compact car. Some of these cars were like those rebooted movie franchises. You want to like them, but deep down, you know they'll never be as good as the originals. But how did this all happen? Why did car companies, normally obsessed with the future, suddenly become so obsessed with the past? Well, my friend, the answer is simple: marketing and money. Car manufacturers realized that nostalgia sells. The people who grew up with muscle cars in the 60s and 70s, well, by the 2000s they had money. They were in their 40s and 50s, looking for ways to relive their youth. And what better way to do that than with a brand new car that looked like the one they had as a teenager? It was a genius move. And it worked. But here's the kicker. Not only did older buyers love these retro cars, but younger generations got into them too. Suddenly, a whole new wave of car enthusiasts was falling in love with designs that were technically older than they were. It was like watching vinyl records make a comeback in an age of MP3s. People didn't just want what was new, they wanted what was cool. And retro was cool. So there you have it, the perfect storm. Car companies were making nostalgia-powered money machines, and people couldn't get enough. But as with all trends, the question wasn't how long will this last, but rather, when will it all go wrong? And oh boy, did it ever. So who kicked off this whole retro car epidemic? Who was patient zero? Well, it depends on who you ask. Some people might say it all started with the Plymouth Prowler, a car that looked like it drove straight out of a 1930s gangster movie. Others might argue that the Volkswagen New Beetle fired the first real shot in the late 90s. But honestly, it was more of a slow infection rather than one single car setting off the entire movement. So let's break it down. The Plymouth Prowler, 1997 to 2002. The first sign of madness. Imagine you're a designer at Chrysler in the mid-90s. Your boss walks in and says, "Hey, remember hot rods? Let's make one. But instead of a big V8, let's slap in a V6. And instead of making it a real muscle car, let's make it kind of weak." And that's how we got the Plymouth Prowler, a car that looked incredible but drove like a letdown. It had the body of a rebel but the soul of a rental car. With its exposed front wheels, low-slung stance, and aggressive styling, it looked like it should be tearing up the streets. But under the hood, a 3.5 LV6 borrowed from Chrysler's most boring sedans. Oh, and it had an automatic transmission only, because of course it did. People wanted to love the Prowler. It was different. It was bold. It was a hot rod for the modern era. But then they actually drove it, and the illusion shattered. It was fast enough, sure, but it didn't have the raw muscle car power people expected from something that looked like it should be drag racing at midnight. Still, it was an important first step. It proved that people were willing to buy cars that looked old but were technically new, and that's all car companies needed to see. The Volkswagen New Beetle, 1998 to 2011. The one that made retro cool again. If the Prowler was a test run, then the Volkswagen New Beetle was the first real patient zero of the retro movement. Let's be real. The original VW Beetle is one of the most iconic cars of all time. It was the people's car, the hippie car, the car that just wouldn't die. So when Volkswagen announced they were bringing it back, people lost their minds. And on the surface, it made sense. The new Beetle had that same bubbly, friendly shape as the original. It was cute, it was quirky, it was pure nostalgia. But then, VW did something weird. Instead of putting the engine in the back like the classic Beetle, they made the new Beetle a front-engine, front-wheel drive car, which meant, under the retro skin, it was really just a Volkswagen Golf in disguise. And the strangest part, the flower vase. Yes, you read that right. VW put an actual built-in flower vase on the dashboard because they thought that's what Beetle fans wanted. You know, for putting little daisies in their cars while they sat in traffic. Despite the weirdness, the new Beetle was a massive hit. It sold like crazy, and it proved something important. Nostalgia sells. People will buy a car that reminds them of the past, even if it's not exactly the same. And just like that, the floodgates opened. The Ford Thunderbird, 2002 to 2005, a perfect example of be careful what you wish for. At this point, Ford was watching all of this from the sidelines thinking, all right, our turn. And that's how we got the 2002 Ford Thunderbird, a modern-day reboot of the classic 1950s T-Bird. Ford took everything that made the original Thunderbird cool, the long, low body, the round headlights, the classy two-seater design, and they brought it back with a modern twist. On paper, it should have been a hit. It was stylish. It had a V8. It had luxury touches. And yet, it flopped. Why? Because it turns out that while people love to reminisce about old cars, that doesn't always mean they want to buy them. The problem was that the Thunderbird was too much like the original. It was more of a cruiser than a true performance car. It was meant to be stylish and comfortable, but that wasn't what people really wanted in the 2000s. Buyers wanted excitement, not a car that looked like something their grandparents drove to the golf course. And that's when automakers realized something crucial. Retro styling is great, but the car still has to be exciting to drive. Which brings us to the moment when everything changed. The one that changed the game, the 2005 Ford Mustang. By the early 2000s, the Mustang was struggling. The 90s versions had lost the magic of the original muscle cars. Sales were dipping. The Mustang was losing its identity. And then, in 2005, Ford did something brilliant. They fully embraced the retro look. They took everything that made the late 60s Mustangs iconic, the long hood, the aggressive front grille, the muscular stance, and they modernized it just enough to feel fresh. But here's what made the 2005 Mustang different from the Thunderbird or the Beetle. It wasn't just about nostalgia. It was a car that people actually wanted to drive. It had real muscle car power. It looked aggressive, not just cute. It felt like an evolution, not just a copy-paste of the past. And guess what? It worked. People went crazy for it. Mustang sales shot through the roof, and suddenly every other car company was like, oh damn, we need to do this too. And that's when the real retro madness began. Suddenly, the Dodge Challenger was back. The Chevy Camaro returned. Even luxury brands started playing the game. Everyone wanted a piece of that nostalgia pie. Some of them got it right. Some of them got it very, very wrong. But one thing was clear. The 2005 Mustang changed everything. And that's where things really start to get interesting. So by the mid-2000s, the retro car trend wasn't just a trend anymore. It was a full-on movement. The 2005 Mustang had just proved that nostalgia sells, and not just a little bit. It sold like crazy. Dodge and Chevy took one look at those Mustang sales numbers and went, yeah, we're doing that too. And just like that, the muscle car wars were officially back on. Ford had its Mustang. Dodge was working on bringing back the Challenger. Chevy dusted off the blueprints for a brand new Camaro. And suddenly it was the 1970s all over again, but with fuel injection and airbags. But here's where things get really interesting. Because once automakers realized that slapping an old-school design on a new car could print money, they lost all restraint. The return of the muscle cars. When it was actually cool. Let's be real. The late 90s and early 2000s had some cool performance cars, but most of the muscle cars, they weren't exactly killing it. The Camaro had been discontinued in 2002 because nobody was buying them anymore. The Mustang? Yeah, it still existed, but it wasn't exciting anymore. The Dodge Charger? It was a four-door sedan, which was basically sacrilege to muscle car purists. Then came 2008, and Dodge said, you know what? Screw subtlety. That's when they dropped the new Dodge Challenger, a car that looked like it had time-traveled straight from 1970, just bulkier, meaner, and packing a Hemi V8 under the hood, and the world loved it. Chevy wasn't about to let Dodge and Ford have all the fun, though. So in 2010, the Camaro returned, and it came back with a vengeance. Unlike the Challenger, which stayed faithful to the original design, the new Camaro was a more futuristic take on the classic late 60s model. It had the shape, the stance, the aggression, but with sharper lines and a more modern feel. And just like that, the muscle car wars were officially reborn. The 2010 S became an absolute golden age for modern muscle. The Mustang got even better with the 2011 5.0 Coyote engine. The Challenger kept getting crazier, eventually giving us the 700-plus horsepower Hellcat. The Camaro ZL1 came out swinging with supercharged insanity. But here's the problem. Once the Big Three had cemented the return of muscle cars, the rest of the industry started getting a little too comfortable with the whole retro revival thing. And that's when things went off the deep end. When retro went too far. It started with some cool, logical revivals. But then automakers started digging into the archives for cars that absolutely no one asked for. You know how Hollywood has a bad habit of rebooting movies that didn't need a reboot? Yeah, car companies started doing the same thing. The Chevy HHR, 2005 to 2011. Hey, what if the PT Cruiser, but worse? The PT Cruiser was already pushing it with its weird faux 1930S styling. So Chevy looked at it and went, let's do that, but make it less fun. Enter the Chevy HHR, which looked like a PT Cruiser that had been stretched out and flattened. It had all the retro styling, but none of the charm. Chevy tried to sell it as a heritage high-roof vehicle, hence the name HHR, inspired by the old Chevy Suburbans from the 1940s. But let's be real. Nobody in the 2000s was dreaming about 1940s Suburbans. And the worst part, they actually made an HHR panel van version. Like, why? Who was asking for a 1940s delivery van in 2008? The Jaguar S-Type, 1999 to 2008, when retro luxury goes wrong. Okay, I get it. Jaguar wanted to bring back some of that classic British luxury from the 1960s. The problem? They made the Jaguar S-Type, a car that looked like someone stuck a 60s Jag grille onto a bloated, boring sedan. Jaguar tried so hard to make this car work. They even brought in a supercharged V8 version to make it seem cool. But no amount of horsepower could hide the fact that it looked like something your retired uncle would drive to the golf course. The "What Were They Thinking?" Hall of Fame. But wait, it gets worse. All right, so by the mid-2000s, the retro car craze was running at full speed. Muscle cars were back in a big way. Weird throwback designs were popping up everywhere, and automakers were digging through their history books like a student cramming for a final exam. But then, everything changed. In 2008, the world got hit with the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. Banks collapsed. Stock markets tanked. People were losing their jobs left and right. And you know what happens when a global economic meltdown hits? People stop buying fun cars. The end of the party, when automakers hit the brakes. Before the crash, car companies were riding high. They were throwing out new retro-styled models like candy at a parade. But once the economy imploded, all that nostalgia-fueled madness got a harsh reality check. Car sales plummeted. People weren't buying flashy sports cars anymore. They were looking for fuel efficiency and affordability. Gas prices skyrocketed. Suddenly, that V8 muscle car wasn't looking so appealing when it cost you a fortune just to drive to work. Car companies started dying. Chrysler and GM went bankrupt. Ford barely survived. The last thing they needed to do was waste money on fun cars. And just like that, the retro car movement slammed into a brick wall. The death of the for-fun retro cars. Some of the weirdest and most unnecessary retro cars got killed off immediately. The Chevy SSR, dead, thank God. The Chrysler PT Cruiser, killed in 2010. It lasted way longer than it should have. The Ford Thunderbird, already gone by 2005. Ford saw the writing on the wall early. It was no longer the time for nostalgia. Now it was all about survival. And that's when car companies started making some tough choices. Muscle cars versus reality, who survived. Now here's the interesting part. Muscle cars survived. While most of the goofy retro cars were being axed, the Mustang, Camaro, and Challenger kept going. But even they had to adapt to the new world. Suddenly, it wasn't enough for a muscle car to just look cool. It had to be more efficient, more advanced, and more practical. So what did they do? Ford gave the Mustang an EcoBoost turbocharged 4-cylinder engine because V8s weren't practical for everyone anymore. Chevy modernized the Camaro with better tech, fuel efficiency, and aerodynamics. Dodge somehow convinced everyone that a 700-plus HP Hellcat was a reasonable idea. And honestly, respect. The nostalgia factor was still there, but now these cars were being built for the modern era. They weren't just tributes to the past anymore. They were actually great cars. But even as muscle cars adapted, the retro car movement itself was dying. The 2010 S. The death of retro, the birth of the future. By the early 2010 S, automakers stopped living in the past and started focusing on the future. Look at the biggest car trends of the 2010 S. Electric cars. Tesla blew up, and suddenly everyone cared about EVs. Fuel efficiency and hybrids gas prices were still unstable, so people wanted mileage. Tech-focused cars, infotainment systems, driver assist features, and futuristic designs took over. And where did that leave the retro cars? Pretty much nowhere. Yeah, the Mustang, Camaro, and Challenger survived, but they evolved. They weren't just retro throwbacks anymore. They became true performance cars that just happened to have classic styling. Meanwhile, cars like the new Beetle, gone. The Fiat 500, struggling. The Mini Cooper, barely hanging on. And just like that, the retro epidemic of the 2000s was over. But here's the big question. Did it actually matter? Did the retro craze leave a lasting impact, or was it just a weird phase? That's exactly what we're diving into next. Alright, so we've seen how the retro car craze blew up in the 2000s like a firework on steroids. Automakers were digging deep into their history, throwing back to the glory days of muscle cars, classic designs, and quirky, nostalgia-heavy concepts. People were loving it, right? The world seemed to be all about vintage vibes and chrome nostalgia. But then, just as fast as it came, it fizzled out like a bad pop song from the early 2000s. So, what happened? Why did the retro wave crash and burn so quickly? Well, let's dive in because it's not as simple as it just being a phase. 1. The nostalgia gimmick wore thin. Let's face it, nostalgia is like the easy way out for a car designer. Sure, it works for a hot minute, especially when you slap a throwback to the 60s on something shiny and new. But here's the issue. Nostalgia is a drug. You get high off it for a while, but eventually you realize it's just making you feel empty inside. People started to catch on to the fact that these retro designs weren't all they were cracked up to be. Yeah, the Mustang looked cool in 2005 with its 60s vibe, but did it have anything other than a muscle car body? Was the PT Cruiser just a disaster wrapped in the warm, fuzzy blanket of past memories? Absolutely. What was meant to be nostalgic quickly turned into gimmicky, and people started realizing that nostalgia alone couldn't sustain a car for long. The novelty faded faster than you can say, hot rod, and that was the beginning of the end for the retro wave. 2. The world changed, gas prices, global warming, and the green movement. By the time we were deep into the 2000s, the world was changing in ways that retro design simply couldn't keep up with. Gas prices. So let's talk about gas prices for a second. Remember when gasoline prices hit the roof around 2008? Suddenly, people weren't as interested in guzzling gallons of fuel for the sake of a car that looked cool. The muscle car era was back, yes, but no one was too keen on paying $4 a gallon for something that looked like it should be burning rubber at high speeds. While the 2005 Mustang made an impact, it also came with a thirsty V8 that made owners wonder if they should have invested in a hybrid instead. Let's not even get started on the Chrysler SSR, which had all the retro charm of a minivan but none of the practicality. It was like driving a Hershey's bar on wheels, sweet but not sustainable. The green movement. And let's not forget the eco-conscious shift that was happening around the same time. People were starting to care about the planet and energy efficiency. Electric vehicles, EVs, were no longer just a pipe dream, and car companies like Tesla were starting to prove that performance and environmental impact could go hand in hand. Who was going to care about a muscle car with a V8 when the future was clearly about sustainability? The whole idea of reviving gas-guzzling monsters was starting to feel, well, a little irresponsible. 3. The lack of innovation. All style, no substance. Look, the retro cars look cool as hell. You can't deny that a brand new Challenger or Mustang with that classic muscle car look was drool-worthy. But here's the problem. These cars weren't evolving the way they needed to. They were getting by on style alone. A lot of these cars, especially the ones coming out of the early 2000s retro boom, felt more like shrines to the past than anything pushing the automotive industry forward. Sure, they had retro curves and lines, but beneath that shiny exterior there wasn't much new happening. The Chrysler PT Cruiser was fun for a minute with its quirky vintage vibes, but what did it actually do? It was as far from revolutionary as you could get. An old-school look with no real updates to the tech or performance that would make it stand the test of time. It was nostalgia without innovation. And it's pretty hard to get excited about a car when all it does is remind you of something cooler. Eventually, people started asking themselves, why am I paying for a retro look if the car doesn't perform? And the answer for most people was, you're not. 4. The financial crisis. People stopped spending on flashy cars. Then, of course, there was 2008. The global financial crash came out of nowhere, and suddenly, the entire auto industry was thrown into a panic. People weren't throwing money at muscle cars anymore. They were busy trying to keep their homes and jobs. That's when the retro car movement came to a screeching halt. People weren't buying flashy sports cars just because they had a cool design or a nostalgic vibe. They were looking for affordable, reliable transportation. People had to tighten their belts, and when that happens, the first thing to go: unnecessary expenses. Muscle cars and retro models just didn't make sense anymore in an economy in crisis. Gas was expensive, insurance was high, and no one was willing to drop big bucks on a car they didn't need. The retro wave was a victim of real-world economics. 5. Competition from the future electric cars and tech. By the time the 2010s rolled around, the retro craze was practically a distant memory. While the Mustang, Camaro, and Challenger survived, barely, automakers had started to put more focus on the future. Electric cars took over. Enter Tesla and the electric revolution. Suddenly, the idea of keeping the past alive didn't seem that important when cars like the Tesla Model S were offering mind-blowing performance, futuristic technology, and a whole new driving experience. Even if you loved retro, you had to admit, EVs were the future. They had better tech, more efficiency, and better performance. The cool retro cars couldn't compete with the quiet efficiency of an electric vehicle that could go 0 to 60 miles per hour in under 3 seconds. Tech-savvy cars. At the same time, car buyers were becoming tech-savvy. The 2000s retro cars didn't have smart tech, driver assistance systems, or advanced infotainment. They were, in some ways, just a cool throwback with modern amenities. But that wasn't enough anymore. People were demanding more. 6. It was all about the past, and the past can only take you so far. At the end of the day, the retro wave died because it couldn't look forward. It was all about looking backward. You can only ride the nostalgia train for so long before people realize they want new experiences. And while the muscle cars survived, thankfully, the other retro disasters faded into obscurity. The future of cars was about sustainability, tech, and performance. And the retro wave didn't fit into that vision. It was like putting an old jukebox in the middle of a nightclub. Sure, it's fun for a while, but eventually, you realize it just doesn't match the vibe anymore. Part 6. The Legacy of the Retro Boom. All right, we've been riding this nostalgic roller coaster all the way from the rise of retro cars in the early 2000s to their eventual crash and burn by the mid-2010s. But now that we're looking back from the future, what is the real legacy of the retro car boom? Was it just a fleeting moment of madness, or did it leave a lasting imprint on the automotive world? Let's dive into this because the impact of the retro movement isn't just about the cars themselves. It's about how they change the culture, the industry, and the way we think about cars today. Trust me, the legacy of the retro boom is still lurking in the corners of modern car design. 1. The resurgence of muscle cars and how they never left. Let's start with the most obvious part of the retro wave's legacy, the muscle cars. If the retro revival did nothing else, it brought muscle cars back from the dead and kept them alive long enough for the next generation of car enthusiasts to appreciate them. The Mustang, Camaro, and Challenger, still kicking ass. Remember when the Ford Mustang made a roaring comeback in 2005 with that old-school 60s vibe? It wasn't just a blast from the past. It lit a fire under the entire automotive industry. Chevrolet and Dodge weren't going to let Ford have all the fun, so they brought back the Chevy Camaro and the Dodge Challenger with their own retro-inspired designs. Fast forward to today, and these cars have become modern-day legends. The Mustang GT500 isn't just a car. It's a piece of American history, blending classic styling with modern performance that blows your hair back. And don't even get me started on the Dodge Hellcats, the supercharged beasts that have become the gold standard of performance cars in the U.S. The retro movement made these cars not only relevant again, but it also ensured that the muscle car wouldn't just go the way of the dinosaurs. So, yeah, the retro wave gets the credit for keeping the muscle car alive and kicking, even in 2025. 2. The resurrection of iconic brands and models. You know what's crazy? Some cars that came back during the retro wave should have never gone away in the first place. But thanks to the retro revival, brands that had all but disappeared were given a second shot at glory. The Jeep Wrangler, a legend, refined. The Jeep Wrangler was already an icon, but when the retro movement hit, Jeep knew exactly what to do. They stuck with the classic boxy design that made the Wrangler famous, but they added enough modern tech to make it a truly usable off-road machine. The return of the Wrangler was like hitting the reset button for the entire off-road market. They took the past, sprinkled in a bit of modernity, and bam, the Wrangler became a timeless classic. The Dodge Challenger and Charger, hitting the gas again. Dodge took a massive risk when it revived the Challenger in 2008, and people loved it. It didn't just revive a forgotten muscle car. It was like they brought back the entire vibe of the American highway. And let's not forget the Charger. Dodge knew people wanted a car with muscle, and they delivered a four-door muscle car that could stand toe-to-toe with some of the most aggressive two-door sports cars. Today, the Charger Hellcat is still one of the most outrageous sedans on the market, and it wouldn't have existed without the retro boom to pave the way. 3. The retro influence on design language today. It wasn't just about bringing back specific cars. It was about redefining a design language. The retro era of the 2000s wasn't just about making cars look old school. It was about mixing past influences with modern design philosophies. The return of iconic elements. Take the Ford Bronco, for example. It's a perfect marriage of the past and present. The Bronco's return in 2020 was more than just a car coming back. It was an entire revival of the off-road spirit. Sure, it had the boxy, utilitarian shape of the original Bronco, but everything from the tech to the performance screamed modern. It was a retro car that didn't shy away from being fully updated for today's standards. That same spirit is still alive in cars like the Chevrolet Corvette C8 or even the Toyota GR86. These cars blend classic design elements with a modern edge, and they do it seamlessly. That's the essence of the retro legacy, taking the essence of the past but constantly evolving it for the future. 4. The nostalgia is still here, but it's more subtle now. One of the biggest things that the retro movement of the 2000s did was prove that nostalgia sells. We all love a good throwback, and there's no denying that classic designs tap into a deep emotional connection we have with cars of the past. Today's cars, the retro influence lives on. But here's the thing. Today's nostalgia isn't as in-your-face as it was in the early 2000s. Manufacturers have learned that subtlety works better. Think about how the Chevrolet Camaro and Ford Mustang are designed today. They still have those retro cues, but they aren't just old-school replicas. They've evolved those designs into something modern and refined. The Jeep Gladiator, for example, channels the old Jeep pickups of the past, but in a way that makes sense for today's off-roading culture. It's not just about looks. It's about bringing something timeless into a contemporary context. The retro movement didn't just pump out revived models. It taught manufacturers how to tap into emotional connections with their customers. People want to feel something when they buy a car, and retro designs have become a major part of how automakers create that bond. 5. A warning for the future. Why we shouldn't over-rely on nostalgia. While the retro wave left a lasting mark on the car world, there's a cautionary tale here as well. Automakers shouldn't get too comfortable relying on nostalgia to sell cars. Sure, it worked in the short term, but it can't carry the industry forever. Eventually, people want more. More tech, more sustainability, and more future thinking. So yes, nostalgia has its place. But the future of the car industry isn't just about looking back. It's about innovating for what comes next.